Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I appreciate you watching today. I want to thank everyone who lent their assistance to our addiction recovery fireside. You've made it possible for the event to be held in the new BYU Music Building Concert Hall, and will be accompanied by the marvelous 300-member BYU men's and women's choral groups who will have sung in conference just the week before. This is a free event, so if you know someone who has a member of their family or who is struggling to stay on the covenant path, this would be a very inspirational event for them to attend. You can see more details about this besides the flyer on screen right now in episodes 65 and 66. I also want to thank everyone who has shared their inspirational stories with us. You can share those to my email, which is listed in the first comment on this and many other episodes, or a lot of the listeners love to read them, so you can put the whole story in the comment section. I have some great stories today that come from an 1881 publication for the youth of the church called A String of Pearls. I've told other stories from this publication in earlier episodes, but preparing these stories from these really old books is like translating them from another language. The way they spoke was so different. The sentence structure, the wording, the phraseology is almost like a foreign language, so it takes a while to get them ready. The first story is from President John Taylor. He says, in the latter part of October in 1849, a large group of missionaries started east to embark on some very important missions. Among them were several members of the Quorum of the 12. John Taylor, John Pack, and Curtis E. Bolton were all going to France. Franklin D. Richards was on his way to England. Lorenzo Snow on his way to Italy to convert some of my ancestors, and Erastus Snow to Denmark to bring the gospel to another line of my ancestors. Bishop Edward Hunter, A.O. Smoot, Edwin D. Woolley, Joseph Haywood, and Jedediah M. Grant, along with a number of other elders and brethren, accompanied this group as they journeyed toward many missions throughout the world. Several merchants also accompanied them on their journey. On reaching Fort Laramie, Wyoming, it was late in the season, and the snow began to fall. It soon covered the whole country with about a foot of snow. After they crossed the Platte River, they were met by a miraculous circumstance, which they all looked upon as divine intervention in their behalf from the Almighty. As they traveled day after day, the deepening snow all around them had been blown off the road, they said, as if it had been swept off by a broom. The clear track was just on the road. This condition continued the entire distance before them until they reached Fort Kearny. However, the snow-covered conditions of winter made it difficult to feed their animals because there was no natural vegetation, and several of them died before they reached the Missouri River. The day before the group reached the Missouri River, they were overtaken by a fierce winter storm. It made it very difficult for their weakened animals, and many gave out. After much difficulty, they reached an old deserted fort on the Missouri River, where they found scanty shelter. It was a deserted log house with no windows or doors and large openings between the logs. President Taylor recalled, "I'm not aware of any time in my life where I've experienced a greater sense of providential interposition and relief than I did with that temporary refuge from that fierce storm." The next day they were blessed to receive assistance from a family that lived nearby. They provided a warm meal to the group and feed for their animals, but they advised them that the ice was running strong in the river, which made a ferry crossing impossible. President Taylor said the next night was one of the most severely cold nights he ever experienced in his life. After they had struggled through this frigid, windy night, some of their group made their way down to the river to evaluate the conditions. They observed that the floating ice had lodged into an ice dam, forming an ice bridge across the river. A company was then organized to see if it was safe or even possible to use the ice bridge to cross this vast river. When they returned, they said they thought the ice, though very thin, would bear them across. The entire company quickly packed up and left their scanty shelter to cross the Missouri River. The crossing was precarious, and the ice dam very rough, but they got their wagons across. As the last of their group reached the land on the other side, the ice became shaky and uncertain. They had used all the energy they could to get their teams over the ice as quickly as possible. The last of them had only just made it across the river when the ice gave way and floated down the river, thus exhibiting another remarkable manifestation of the providence of God toward his elders. I'm sure much of the church today can trace the roots of their family's conversion to the efforts of these pioneering missionaries as they spread the message of the restoration throughout the world on those important missions. President Taylor summarized these miraculous events by saying, "Many people would be apt to look upon these things as natural occurrences. I, however, ascribe them to the power of that being who says the hairs of our head are numbered, and that a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without our Father's notice." Another wonderful story that demonstrates the Lord's awareness of his missionaries comes from Elder Thomas Phillips of Scipio, Utah. In his own words, he recounts a tender mercy of the Lord that overtook him during his mission. He says, "I have witnessed the providences of the Lord in various ways while traveling without purse or script, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Lord manifests his loving kindness and his watchful care over the faithful. They need only eyes to recognize his hand in their behalf. One experience of many during my service may appear small to some, but it is of particular interest to me. I was traveling without purse or script in the towns and villages of England, in the county of Surrey, preaching the truth of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Under these circumstances, food and raiment were sometimes hard to obtain. Consequently, at one time I had a hat that was very much the worse for wear. In a village called Hersham in that county lived a brother by the name of William Hobbs, whose house I sometimes visited and received food and lodging from him several times. One night, Brother Hobbs dreamed that a personage came to him and told him that Elder Phillips would be at his house on a certain day, naming the time, which was only 5 days from the time he had the dream. He was further told that he must get a new hat for Elder Phillips, for the one he wore was very shabby. This dream impressed the mind of Brother Hobbs very much, but troubled him sorely for days. He had no money for a hat, and was a great distance from any town where one could even be obtained. Brother Hobbs was the foreman of a small number of men whose job it was to keep the railroad in repair for safe passage of trains traveling through their area. When the day came, which he had been told I would arrive at his house, he went to work very low in spirits, not having found a hat. That afternoon, while they were working on the track, a long train sped by, and while passing the place where Brother Hobbs and his men were working, a hat, suitable for the finest gentleman in the land, flew out of one of the windows as the train passed them. Brother Hobbs shouted, "That's the hat for Elder Phillips. Thank the Lord." When Brother Hobbs came home that evening, there I was, exactly as he had been told in his dream. He walked up to me and said, "Elder Phillips, I was told to give you a hat, and here it is." To both of our surprise, it fit me perfectly. I was anxious to know who was so thoughtful for an elder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and asked him who had told him I needed a hat. In answer to my questions, Brother Hobbs told me of his dream, and how the Lord had provided this hat. I knew then, and still know, that the providences of our Heavenly Father were and are working in favor of his saints and of the servants of the Most High. Thousands of elders could testify that they have realized the fulfillment of similar blessings while traveling among the nations of the earth without purse or script. When in want, they have petitioned the Lord in their humble prayer of faith for aid to them in their hour of need, and he has not forsaken them. Brother Matthias F. Cowley, father of Matthew Cowley, tells the story of a young elder in one of the southern states whose boots were worn out and his toes were protruding. He humbly asks the Lord in a very plain and simple manner to provide him with a pair of shoes. A day or two later, at the close of a meeting, a gentleman came to the elder and asked him to accept some money which would aid him in obtaining a pair of shoes. The following day, a shoemaker who had made the acquaintance of the elder happened by where he was staying and observed that the elder needed new shoes. He told the elder that he had just made a new pair of shoes for himself, but somehow they didn't fit him. They were too small. The shoemaker asked the elder if he would accept the shoes as a present. The elder received them gratefully, and when he put them on, found the shoes fit as if they had been made specifically for him. I'm sure the Lord had a part in the cobbler's mistake. Thus he received a literal answer to his prayer, and more too. Neither of the good people who contributed to his need had been asked to assist him, but they both heard the voice of the Lord and were able to help the Lord's servants. It is not just missionaries and saints that are recipients of the Lord's blessings. In the year 1864, a little boy named Charles lived with his mother and sister in the city of Carmel, near the central part of Indiana. His father and older brother had enlisted and were fighting with the Union Army. Charles was only 4 years of age, not large enough to earn anything. He and his sister were entirely dependent upon whatever their mother earned by her hard day's labor for their daily food. It was in the winter season. Times were hard for everyone because of the terrible war, and the conditions grew worse every day. The people in the community had little to offer the mother, so it was with great difficulty that she earned enough for herself and children to live upon. Financing for the war had been tentative, and she had not received the wages she expected from her husband and son's service to the Union. One morning, she went out in a cold, wintry blast and gathered bark from the fence rails to provide a little warmth to keep her children from suffering in the severe cold. That morning, she gave them the last crust of bread that was in the house, not eating anything herself. Then she went out into the city searching for some way to earn more bread for her little ones. After a futile, long search, she returned empty-handed. Very tired, both in body and mind, she sat down and wept bitterly. Her children were crying for food, and she had none to give them. When they asked her for food again, she tenderly told them, "The Lord will provide." She then knelt down and between her sobs pled with the Lord to spare her children's lives. When she rose to her feet, she suddenly thought of the carpet rags she had put into a barrel just the day before. It occurred to her that perhaps she could take them to a store where they might see some value in them and trade her for a little bread. She turned to her crying children and said, "Dear children, don't cry. The Lord will not let us starve." Then she emptied the carpet rags onto the floor from the barrel. After she set the barrel back down, she noticed something in the bottom of the barrel. She looked more carefully and saw a dollar bill. In their frugal condition, she knew she had never misplaced such a prize. She had just washed out the barrel the day before when she placed the rags into it. She knew the money was not there then. This dollar allowed her to purchase enough bread to last them a few days, until they finally received $70 owed to them from the Army for her husband's and son's service. I think this story was actually told by the young boy who experienced it. In these old books, sometimes the attributions are quite vague. Brother Wallace Bastion recounts the Lord's bounteous blessings in his life as he inherited adult responsibilities while in his mid-teens. He says, I was born in the year 1835 and was reared in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and shared in its persecutions. In 1848, at the age of 13, I drove 3 yoke of cattle from winter quarters to Salt Lake Valley without an accident worth mentioning. The team consisted of 5 cows and 1 ox. After we arrived and got fairly settled, my parents both died and left me alone, without an education, as was the case with many young folks who were driven with the saints and therefore deprived of formal schooling. Even though I was only 17, in my circumstances I concluded to follow our leader's counsel, get married, and make a home for myself. I went to President Brigham Young, as I was well acquainted with him, and told him what I was considering doing. Despite my age, he advised me to get married. So I took his counsel and married. By necessity, and at my wife's parents' request, we lived with them for a short time. We had not the value of $50 all told. My vocation was that of a farmer, but drawbacks we had in consequence of crickets, grasshoppers, drought, alkali, etc., can be better imagined than described. Despite these setbacks, the following experience will suffice to show how my wife and I were blessed by the Lord. In the spring of 1855, seed wheat and breadstuffs were very scarce. I had none. However, a neighbor I had done some work for owed me a few bushels of wheat, and as planting season was upon us, I went to collect it. When I arrived, he was absent from his home, but his wife, being acquainted with me, told me to go to the granary and help myself. I had loaded all the wheat that was due me except the last half bushel, and was filling that when the temptation came to me. I could easily take more of my neighbor's wheat. I desperately needed more wheat to plant, and also to sustain us until the harvest. He had plenty of wheat, and I only had the little I was now retrieving. I could easily take more, and no one would ever know. My neighbor would not even miss it. I entertained this idea as I filled the last bushel. Then I realized I had listened to the voice of the tempter. As a self-imposed consequence of entertaining the adversary's voice, I emptied the half bushel that was then in my hand back into my neighbor's bin, and did not take all that was my just due. I took my wheat home. It was not nearly as much as I wished to sow, but I was satisfied and thankful for it nonetheless. I placed it in a room adjoining the one where we were staying, and prepared the ground. Then I took the seed wheat from my small store to sow my soil with. I sowed all the ground I wished to, and sowed it thickly, as I wished to have a good crop at harvest time. To my surprise, afterwards, I noticed that I still had some sacks of wheat left. I thought we had somehow mingled our wheat with my in-laws. But we investigated, and they were my sacks. It was my wheat. I called my wife's attention to the matter, and at that moment the Spirit of the Lord rested upon us, and we knew in our hearts that our wheat had been increased by a loving Heavenly Father for our good. I took the remaining wheat and had it ground, which gave us enough flour to last until our harvest. We knew we had been blessed by the Lord, for which we gave God the glory. I bear testimony that my wheat at that time was increased by the power of the same God that increased the widow's oil in ancient times. These, with many other blessings, serve to keep us humble and faithful to our covenants. I would like to say that I have been blessed for following the counsel of my prophet and marrying at an early age. Now, at the age of 44, I'm the father of 19 children, 4 of whom are married, and I now have 7 grandchildren. I am also a bishop in Zion. I mention this not to boast, but to show what can be done by hard work, being faithful, and observing the counsel of those who have been called by the Lord to guide and direct us. I'm afraid if our prophet counseled a 17-year-old to marry today and start a family, it would certainly be disparaged on the evening news broadcasts. Before I start this last story, let me clarify something with some of our listeners. I've received multiple criticisms and corrections by some of our listeners after quoting first-hand accounts concerning the length of time required to cross the Atlantic by the saints in the 1860s. These listeners have insisted that an Atlantic crossing in the 1860s only took 7 to 10 days. However, these commentators have derived their opinion from post-dated observations of events 150 years after the fact. They have no first-hand experience or information, but they've incorrectly assumed, based on the more expensive steamer crossing times, that the saints could do it in a week or 10 days. But the saints could not afford the latest, fastest mode of transportation. The large groups financed by the immigration funds arranged for more economical, older sailing ships, which were much slower, but a fraction of the cost. All of the first-hand accounts I have found describing these crossings have reported at least 6 weeks for the crossing, some much longer. In the year 1866, President Brigham Young appointed my wife's great-grandfather, Henry Bigler, to take charge of a company of about 500 saints on their way to Salt Lake City. He was to lead them from Great Britain to the banks of the Missouri River. This is what he records. The saints did not cross the sea in fast-sailing steamships in those days. They frugally traveled over the waters in older, slow-going sailing ships, depending on favorable winds for progress. At the time, 6 weeks was considered the usual length of time for a voyage from England to New York in one of those old sailing vessels. He continues, "We left the port of London on the 23rd of May in 1866. A very fine company of people, not a few of whom I'm pleased to say are good, honorable members of the church today all around Utah. I've been fortunate to watch them grow up to manhood, and they are still faithful. We were in the ship the American Congress, and while we sailed, we were near the shores of Newfoundland when a thick fog prevailed for several days, which prevented our Captain Woodward from taking any observations because he was unable to see the sun. Therefore, he could not tell exactly where we were. About this time, Captain Woodward and Brother John Ryder, who now lives in Kanab, were conversing on the part of the ship known as the quarterdeck. I was standing some distance away from them. Brother Ryder happened to turn his face in the direction which the ship was sailing. At that very moment, the fog lifted from the surface of the sea as if a veil or scroll had been raised, and he saw clearly between the fog and the water for some distance ahead. Suddenly, he exclaimed, pointing forward, "Captain, what is that?" Captain Woodward, who was a tall, powerful, and active man, made no answer. There was no time to explain. He sprang to the wheelhouse with the agility of a tiger, knocking the man at the helm head over heels, sending him sprawling onto the deck. At that same moment he grabbed the wheel. He turned it with the most surprising rapidity. As he made these sure but hurried movements, he did not lose his presence of mind. At the same time, he was busy with his hands. He was in complete command of his men and of our ship. He shouted in clear, loud, piercing tones several orders, directing all hands to bout ship. The sailors sprang to their posts. There were active limbs and busy hands among the railing. The good ship American Congress swayed slowly around, and the moment of peril was past. Had this action been delayed even a few moments, the vessel would have been among the breakers, upon the rocks, dashed to pieces, and probably not a soul of the nearly 500 on board would have escaped a watery grave. The rocks and breakers ahead on the line of the vessel's course were what Brother Ryder had seen when the fog lifted. Afterwards, the captain asked us not to say a word to the people about the danger with which the ship had been threatened. We considered it right to respect his desires, he being the commander of the vessel. Besides, we thought his suggestion wise, as a knowledge of what had occurred would doubtless have caused an uneasy feeling among the passengers. Our company was therefore not aware of the great danger they had escaped. Elder Ryder and myself thanked God for his goodness in so manifestly exercising his power in behalf of his saints. The Lord fulfilled the promises of safe passage made to us by his servants at the time we left England for Zion. I love all these stories today. I served part of my mission in Newfoundland, and it does get thick fog there. But these stories really demonstrate that the Lord is involved in the details of our life. We may still experience the cold blasts of life's storms and the hunger of need, but as we do all we can and remember the Lord in our doings, he will guide, direct, and bless our lives. We must see the hand of the Lord in all things. As we do, we will come to know his ways and his voice in our heart and in our mind. The Lord is aware of you. I know that he watches over each of us and is involved in the time that we are on this earth and in the experiences that we encounter and the things that we go through. Help us prepare for eternity. If you have any doubt of the Lord's love for you, I would ask you to take a moment. Try to push the cares and worries out of your mind. Find some place where you can be alone, and then kneel down and ask the Lord sincerely, do you love me? Do you know who I am? Are you aware of what I'm going through? And I promise you, if you will calm your mind and listen, you will feel the Lord's love pour into your heart and into your mind. I know he loves you, and I know he loves me. I hope you've enjoyed these stories today. Again, I'd also love to have you share your stories. You can do that by going to my email, which is listed in the comments after this and many of the other episodes, or you can just tell your story in the comment section. Thanks for watching today. I hope you've enjoyed these stories. You can subscribe here. And if you enjoyed this story, here's a story that comes from the same books that I took today's stories from. And you can watch all of Sunshine for the Soul, Inspirational Stories right here. Thank you.